Yes. So today, during this webinar, being part of MOOC on digital youth work, we have Veronica Stefan managing a long-term project of national agencies called Digital Youth Work, the same like our online course. And Veronica will share some findings from the European mapping of digital youth work, their recent developments around digital youth work competences for youth workers, as well as most recent developments on the assessment of competences, where I also was a little bit involved at the beginning and going to stay involved in some processes in the future as well. So Veronica, the floor is yours, and I'm inviting all of you to also actively use the chat, where you can share your thoughts, comments, and questions to Veronica. So we're going to have also like up to 10 minutes for Veronica to answer questions. She will be showing a number of links in her presentation. So please know that we're going to share a link with you at the end of the webinar, so you can have access to the presentation and you can review it one more time at any moment when it's convenient for you. So Veronica, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Laimonas. Thank you to the team. Hello, everybody. So yeah, I'm Veronica, and since the first question was, where are you streaming from? My case is Bucharest, Romania. But the fun part of the online world is that you don't have to live in the country you work for or you work with. In my case, actually, the work I do primarily is with the Estonian National Agency. And this is just a short intro because as far as I understand, all of you should be familiar by now with what national agencies are. But just briefly, because I've seen some of you coming from Egypt, for example, maybe over there, national agencies are not a very popular concept or a popular institution, but in general, they are known for managing Erasmus Plus programs and activities, European Solidarity Corps. So at least about Erasmus Plus, I'm pretty sure many of you have heard. But they don't always do just this technical and administrative part of, managing funding and grants for NGOs. They also do these kind of support measures like the MOOC you are part of. It's also similar with the project that I work for. And in this digital youth work strategic cooperation, we really look how to support youth work organizations and youth organizations in general in different ways. My focus is particular on digital competencies for both youth workers and organizations. And with these lenses, I will be sharing what's going on. In particular, I'm running one work package dedicated to this topic. There are 4 more others that deal with many other issues. I will invite you a bit later to discover what this strategic cooperation is doing and how you can further benefit, because many more activities are still planned, especially for those interested in online services, even digital competence for young people, not necessarily for youth workers. So this is for you to discover a bit later. But now, focusing a little bit on my, let's say, topic and very close to my heart interest as well, and that is digital competencies of youth workers or other specialists, just like you working with young people. It doesn't matter how you call yourselves. I would like to share with you what we did, why we do. I mean, because whenever we talk about practices in digital youth work, it's not just a specific information of a certain tool that you are going to use, which is great. If you are interested in learning about that, what we do also allows you to explore a little bit that, but I will also share other resources that will allow you to explore very specific and concrete resources and tools and platforms. But this is not my focus today. For me, the focus would be on why digital competencies and why digital youth work, because, and I will also start sharing my screen, this is not something new. I know that you are aware of this. I mean, if you have heard something by now, it's this thing that we had the pandemic that forced us to be as digital as possible. But digital youth work was with us, or some of us, before that. And actually, we have been working and we are developing on what are some generic documents here that we call the European Union Council conclusions. I will not bore you with those. They are not so important for this discussion, but might be interesting for those of you who are interested in also the policy part or understanding, let's say, the history and understanding how we got to today. And and at the end, what will be our main goal as part of this strategic cooperation is understanding what are the digital competencies for youth workers and actually develop tailored assessment tools for youth workers and your organizations. And this is rather important to highlight because we know there are many other practices, and we were aware of that when we started, because we know we don't start in a vacuum, like in an empty space. We are always building on something, but so far, let's say the harmonized approach, it's not there yet. And I think this is what I'm going to start by sharing what are the different realities we have discovered. And the one thing we have looked first and foremost was also a question. And once in a while, I will drop these questions to you as well. So please feel free to reflect in the chat as well, or at least maybe take a note and think about them later on. Why do we need, first of all, separate tools for youth workers and then for organizations? That's something sometimes we are just not stopping. So me as a youth worker is learning something on how to use digital environments or understanding what digital is about. But why should my organization have an assessment tool? How should they work together? Who should use them? I mean, is it still me, the youth worker who has to do so many things, implement projects or work directly with the young people in a youth center, or who? So this is more of a reflection question for you. Then another important thing, again, a thing I'm not going to bore you with, but it's always, you know, the basics that should stick to our mind. What is digital youth work? And this definition was proposed just a couple of years ago. And this was also a reflection point for us when we started understanding what are the realities in different countries. And that is, as the definition was proposed, digital youth work does refer to using and or addressing digital media and technology in youth work. And there's also a funny word here called proactively. So not waiting for the others to tell you what you do, but you taking the initiative. And then there's another thing that is the essence here, that all these technologies, digital, new media that we are using can be a tool, an activity, or a content. Digital youth work, regardless if we are treating it separately, it's not a youth work method. So it's not another youth work method. It's part of youth work. So it's, regardless of the pandemic, it's something that we need to do, we need to include. It is there. It's not an option of if, it's there. And it doesn't matter how experienced or inexperienced you are, it's something probably we always have to keep in mind. Now, we did say that we want to create assessment tools. And here comes what we have learned in terms of the different practices. You don't create assessment tools because you have a feeling that youth workers need something and need to do something or how to do something, but you actually need to anchor it in facts. And that's what we did. And we managed to do this research together with other 10 national agencies from Belgium, the Flemish side, Cyprus, Estonia, Finland, Germany, Iceland, Ireland, Lithuania, Romania, and Turkey. And it might be interesting, especially for those of you who come from these countries, but also who are living in the neighborhood of these countries, because they are quite differently distributed in terms of geography and also in terms of experiences. And of course, we did look in particular what are the digital competence frameworks and assessment tools that are used by youth workers, trainers, educators, and teachers who really broaden the research. So not just the youth work, but also the wider educational sector. And similarly, what are these tools and competence or capacity frameworks for organizations, and then the training materials on digital youth work. So not any online material you could find on youth work, but specific materials that you can have for digital youth work. Like this MOOC is here, right? So it's a particular training opportunity on digital youth work. Now, what did we discover to get to the essence of our discussion? Where there is a wealth of information. Do trust me, once you start going through each and every national report and findings, you are overwhelmed by the amount of information you can get. There are so many different practices, competence building approaches, the topics that are covered. But then there are also very different approaches on how much digital youth work is developed or recognized, and especially what kind of stakeholders are involved in developing digital youth work. There is an essential part here that is important for us to be aware, because right now we are in an international context. So English is our most familiar language, but English, it is nevertheless the language in which most materials are present. But that also means it is a barrier, especially if you think that youth work happens at the local level, and not many youth workers are just part of the international context. They're very much focused on national and local realities. Then language can be a serious issue. And as it happened, it turned out to be mentioned all the time. So digital youth work can be seen more of an elitist topic, and the methods and the practices around it are also available mostly for those who have been exposed to this international context. Moving on. If we are to cluster all these countries that contributed with their findings, what we discovered was three types, let's say, of practices and of countries. And we clustered them in frontrunners, advanced, and emerging. And it's not better or worse. That is just to highlight. You have the frontrunners, and those are usually the countries who have started discussing and working on digital youth work a bit earlier than the others, so much earlier than the pandemic. Overall, digital youth work is not something we have developed 100 years ago. So probably during the past 20 to 15 years, we have started discussing more and more. And during the past 10 to 5 years, we have even accelerated. So might not be a surprise for many of you if I mention Estonia, Finland, or Ireland as being the front runners. But even here, it's so important to understand that in these countries, digital youth work can happen very differently. And I put here at the very bottom of this slide, 3 countries, the 3 front runners. On the one hand, we have Ireland. Ireland is one of the countries where digital youth work is part of higher education, for example. You could apply for a bachelor degree, for a master's degree, even to teach digital youth work or different dimensions related to digital youth work. So it can be more on the creativity side or providing services, using digital tools. So they can be quite diverse, but they are also very rich in how they support and do it within the NGO sector, which I imagine many of you are coming from. Then we look at Estonia. Estonia, again, it's a front runner, but most of the experiences, which also come, of course, from the youth sector, but the richest, the most elaborated ones actually come from the formal education, from programs and tools they have for teachers and schools. And then we look at Finland. Finland has another approach to it, and that is, it is mainstreaming digital youth work as part of youth work in general, because you remember also the definition, digital youth work, it's not another method of youth work, it's still youth work based on the same values and principles. The different thing in Finland is that these practices are not necessarily so much developed or exclusively developed by NGOs as they are supported and developed through the municipalities. So municipalities are really strongly involved and connected with developing digital youth work. And of course, this also shows the different commitment of different stakeholders. And this is, again, for you to digest a little bit. We put in the advanced 2 types of countries, the Flemish side of Belgium and Germany. Here you have, again, a lot of practices, but also in digital youth work. Let's accept that the concept is a bit newer. It was a bit more solidly established around 2018. But before that, we had a lot of media or technology and information learning. That's also part of digital youth work. But in these countries, media and information will be most of the opportunities you have connected to it. And of course, there would be also this different approach towards creating media or using media with a more privacy and safety concern. And then we have the emerging, which I know that when you look at the emerging countries where, let's say, for now, the majority of our involved countries in this research and mapping, it's actually a great thing because they are usually the most innovative and flexible countries. And in this case, at least, the pandemic was a huge booster and pusher in the same way, right? To engage with the digital youth work, to invest in digital youth work. And they are, of course, also the most creative because of this, because they do not have the most established processes. But there is a question of how sustainable these practices are. If they were created, or the majority of them were created during the COVID-19, will they last? That is a question. Now, in terms of specific findings, I will mention something. We are really discussing about frameworks, and I know it sounds, a bit far away from you. Why should I care about a competence framework in general, right? But this MOOC you are part of is based on, I could call it curricula, right? On a definition of competencies that the organizers wanted you to gain at the end of it. And with this in mind, we also looked what's happening in all these countries. How many of them, the youth practitioners, the organizations, other stakeholders are aware of such competence frameworks, and how many actually exist? And of course, there are a few. And we talk here about competence frameworks dedicated to digital dimensions, so digital competencies. There are a few, but very few are dedicated to digital youth work. This is always interesting, right? Us as citizens could have access to digital education, and there could be some competencies defining that, but on youth work, not so much. And most curious was that whatever examples we could find, or the majority of them, were more closely linked to the education of teachers and development of schools. So schools and formal education, in a way, was a bit more proactive than the youth work sector, but then we know that the realities can be, let's say, a bit different. Also because we know that during the pandemic, many of the schools had to disconnect, to close completely until they learn how to reach out again to young people. But still, it's just looking at the broader picture. The youth work sector, in a way, lags behind in terms of digital competencies. But what we did notice as well is that from all the existing competence frameworks focused on the digital dimension, very few were complemented by self-assessment tools. Again, you might want to ask why self-assessment tools? Well, because it's good that you are learning something, but it's also good how much you learn. What exactly did you learn, right? So that's why we looked at both of them. Overall assessment of competencies in digital youth work is not the widespread practices. Of course, we cannot really understand why is it or it's not. So the motivation of using or not using assessment, it's a bit of a question. But this also links back to the training opportunities, to the many learning practices we have discovered. And we have learned that many of them are not informed or built on a competence model. Can also look a bit later what does it mean actually. But here is a food for thought for you. Assessment in general in youth work is not a solid practice, right? I just mentioned that. But why is it? Does the focus on bringing this added value, producing the social change, actually exclude the measurement? Here is really a question for you to have in mind, because while we talk today about digital competencies, and this is what you want to improve as well, youth work as a whole, as a sector, and we as youth workers need to understand what is the value of assessment. And of course, I will not insist on this last part. There are some minuses and there are some benefits that were obvious after this mapping. This fact that we are talking about media and information literacy, or we talk about digital competencies, right? We sometimes can speak about the same thing, meaning more or less an essential thing, and that is the different capacities we need to know and have in order to navigate the technology world in which we are living. And it's not just about using technology, but also how we understand its impact on our everyday lives. But then it doesn't matter, or doesn't it matter that we call it digital youth work or media information literacy. This is, again, something we need to tackle. But then when you will look at practices, or when you will want to share your own practices, keep in mind that sometimes different things can mean the same thing, actually, so regardless of how you call them. Fortunately, Erasmus Plus and a lot of European funding was made available for digital practices and improving digital youth work. And we have also found some very strong practices. I have mentioned several here, and then in our report, you can find them quite elaborated. But this is about competencies for youth workers and trainers, so people just like you. But here is what we found on when we look at organizations. So this is basically the digital capacity or digital transformation in youth work organizations. In short, there was no framework dedicated to this part, digital transformation in youth organization. Didn't seem to have any strategic approach within youth work organizations. So digital transformation was not something you would consciously do, plan for, or assess. And the very few practices we did find, they all came from the educational and private sector. And we really mean strong approaches to digital transformation. That's a bit interesting. And then here comes the training discussion always, because at the end of the day, what is the use of a competence framework if it's not connected with a learning opportunity? Of course, there are a lot of materials, but actually there are not that many materials as you might think. You will discover more of different trainings that have happened, different events, online, offline, but not really strong material that you could use at home for digital youth work. So similar resources as provided in this MOOC are not necessarily so much available in the different countries. Youth workers and youth organizations are the drivers, of course, a lot of focuses, but here are the last two main points I mentioned. And maybe it's also important for you to reflect when you look at your own national or local realities. In many countries, occupational standard for youth work does not exist. So youth work is not recognized as a profession. Does not have, when you go and you will be employed by anybody, you will not be called a youth worker, but because there is no strong understanding or official definition for this profession. And even in the countries where there is such an occupational standard, there is not this dimension of digital competencies, unfortunately yet. And this last point is that there are very few established sustainable practices. It's really a low continuity. So it's very nice that you have one training activity dedicated to improving one competence or more competencies related to digital youth work, but there is no reiteration of them. There is no another opportunity to go and take that training. It's usually a one-time thing. And that's usually what happens when you have just projects running, which of course end because funding ends and resources end. And this was the reality we encountered. Now you might ask, why are these findings important? Well, here this already brings us closer to our discussion and to what you are doing here. Of course, the advancement of digital competencies and of digital youth work has become a priority for many organizations and individuals, especially during the pandemic, but it started before, and that's good. There is a diversity of practices, but also so many resources, especially financial ones to support. Even if it's a new thing, it's a trendy thing, it's also becoming a real political and financial priority, and that's really important. Yet, and here comes the elements. It shows that we don't really understand what it means to be digitally competent, or at least fully digital competent. The opportunities created are mostly based on hunches, feelings, trendy topics that somebody hears about them. It can be, an expert or any kind of organization. They can happen online, offline, with or without wider learning process. So it's more of an event-based, something that I learn in 2-3 days, but my learning stops there, which doesn't happen in your case here. And then there is no assessment part of the process, which is again quite interesting. Organizations clearly don't have this strategic approach towards digital transformation. And basically what happens most of the times is that when the organization doesn't do it, it's just us individuals who do it for ourselves. And of course, who implicitly benefit the organization, but it doesn't have an overall purpose, a bigger purpose, and doesn't lead to bigger impact either, unfortunately. In consequence, in conclusion, if I could say, improvised approaches lead to low quality of digital youth work, including the services we are able to provide to young people and the many opportunities, because the young people are our clients. And when we are not in a conscious process and we cannot develop our digital competencies in a more organized, structured way, then we cannot provide something better either. The digital gap increases because of this. I mean, you hear always these words, digital inequality, digital divide. Well, this fragmented approach is also part of the issue that leads to this situation. Because it's one thing for you to know and feel confident to use technologies or understand the impact of technology, but then it's another thing for you to be confident and competent to work on these issues with young people. And this is something I always underline, and I imagine you're already aware of. The fact that young people are early digital users doesn't transform them into digital savvy people. No, that's far away from using to actually understanding how technology can be used in a meaningful and safe way. And also what is the impact, the larger impact on our basic fundamental rights that technology creates. And this is also part of what it means to be digitally competent. And yeah, this last point here, COVID-19 was a wake-up call, but it didn't really solve the problem. And I think this is really essential for us. And that's why without this strategic approach toward digital transformation, towards building digital competencies for individuals, us youth workers, for the organizations we are part of, this will be a fluke, something that happened now and tomorrow will not be there. And then that's how we get into the picture. And this is how our next steps are being built on these principles that actually assessment will be a learning opportunity. And we are going, and because I get closer to the end of my part, we are building different resources, and the assessment tools are part of those. So it's more of having this European harmonized approach of what means to be digital competent, but equally it could be international. So it really doesn't mean much if I replace European with international. It's just more of a matter of in which context we are working right now. But we are building on the one hand a self-assessment tool for youth workers and trainers in youth work with a peer assessment dimension. I know this is already maybe different. So self-assessment is what I do on my own. When I just fill in a form and I say, okay, where do I think I was? Where does the assessment show me I am? But then peer assessment means actually doing the assessment together with another colleague. Then we work for a self-verification tool, which is more of a test, complementing the self-assessment tool. So it's one thing how I assess myself or how are my peers assessing myself. It's another thing when I take a test, it can be just for myself, but seeing how actually I was assessing myself, how accurate I was in that. And we do something similar for youth organizations. And then this last point here is what we already did, and that is the European report that compiles all these practices that we have mapped at the national level, but then we have also analyzed with a group of European experts. Laimonas was indeed part of that group, together of other people, and national and European researchers and experts. The different best practices are there for you to explore. There is also an initial set of recommendations and measures to complement the assessment tools. And here is another food for thought for you. What recognition organizations would like to get for making these efforts? Because we are aware that thinking about assessment, it's an effort. It's an extra step to do it. First of all, of course, being motivated to get in these kind of training courses, like the MOOC, and then also assessing the competencies. Could the use of such tools be connected with securing more finances for youth activities, like just by showing that the organization invests in assessment and development of the digital capacity? Could a quality label support such a process of encouraging organizations and youth workers to use such tools? And here is again an invitation, and I will leave this presentation with you, and also the link here will be available. We are creating the assessment tools basically as we speak, and in mid-September we will start the initial testing. And I would be very happy if we could have at least some of you interested in joining this process, because it would be really important to create the assessment tools that would fit your need and would be friendly to use as well. So it's not just another assessment tool. So this will stay with you. And at the very end, I've also included the different resources that you can access. So the report from which I take my notes for today and my ideas, the entire cooperation on digital youth work, which we call SNAC, Strategic National Agency Cooperation, but also other resources. And I strongly encourage you to use these other resources because some of them come from Salto participation information, and it's like about more than 100 resources related to digital in youth that we have put together here. There is another study on social inclusion, digitalization in young people that also has references to online platforms and tools that we have mapped. It was just a little bit before the pandemic. And all these are in line with the practices and resources we were supposed to discuss today. And I think I'm ending my intervention here because I noticed that there are several questions and comments in the chat, and I would be very happy to take a look at your own comments and to have your own questions. Because digital competency can be a heavy topic, but actually so much connected with your own motivation to be here and why. And I think it's mostly important to understand that we are part of a process. We always have to aim to be part of a conscious process, I think. Laimonas?
Yes, thanks a lot, Veronica. For now, we will probably stop the recording, so then we can have the rest of the space without recording, so people are free to ask and comment. Yeah.